We have the big honor, in this honor of Fides Pura Vida 2025 in Costa Rica, to have with an international individual. Strategically, will explain the geopolitical context today and its impact in our sector and insurance industry. Iván Duque, former president of Colombia, writer, philanthropist, entrepreneur, President Duque is recognized for his leadership worldwide in high impact initiatives. Amazonia Concordia gather leaders to protect the Amazonian basin and to protect and to develop younger generation in remote areas in Colombia. He had been in charge of several international universities, Oxford for Research Institute, James Goodall Foundation, versus AIM Fund. He's also made part of the board of McKinsey Environmental Efforts, Challenges, and challenges we have in our economy. He will be, without any doubt for us, he will be a value, a guide of value to understand the insurance sector to deal with a more resilient future. We have the President Iván Duque Marquez. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor for me to be again in Fides. And I say again because in my previous role as development banker and also as a senator of the country, because the respect I always have for this insurance sector, I'm pleased to be in this meeting because I know many of you like to approach the big challenges of geopolitical aspects in your industry. And I'll begin by saying, if there is an industry that have to read more than any other, the risk, the volatilities, and these geopolitical scenarios, it's the insurance sector. And I like to begin with a quote. If we fail to prepare, we prepare to fail. It's from Benjamin Franklin. It's the starting point to understand the geopolitical contexts. If the industry, insurance industry, does not prepare to face geopolitical risks that we have before us in the different scenarios, probably we could have failures, structure fails, and unexpected sinisters, which in its economic implications would be very high. On top of that, adding more complexity, you are in the industry that prepare every day. Every day you are analyzing what can happen with the rates of exchange, what can happen with the exchange markets, natural disasters. If we were having this conversation more than 5 years ago, very few of you considered pandemic times as we had in 2020. This takes me to a reflection. This guy you see in the screen is Philippe Petit. Is one of the most important acrobats of history. He became famous because he crossed the former Twin Towers. It's a very high risk profession, but in order to do it, it requires preparation, requires to ponder risks. And my reflection tell me that We're living in a bigger world, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And prepare because it will be bigger most of the rest of the century. Why? Because we have volatilities in terms of regulations, territorial conflicts. We have volatilities in the financial markets, in energy markets. We'll have volatilities in labor markets. We'll have to assume that probably at some point we'll be seeing cyber September 11 somewhere in the world. We'll see complexities and uncertainties in order to evaluate the securities throughout time, and you have to adapt to that. Assets that could have coastal areas that are valued in millions of dollars can change their value simply by the increase of the sea level. People are buying assets that your industry can predict if they will cost less in 1, 2, or 3, 5, 15 years from now. That bigger world that have the invisible conflicts could be decisions in terms of taxes, capital controls that could alter different forecasts. Ambiguity, because not every country define the things the same way. Neither governments take decisions under the same definitions. This is the bigger world we are facing. What is my purpose here? To talk to you about the 10 macro tendencies that will define the course of geopolitics, the global geopolitics, starting with number one. All of you have heard the term global order. We have been speaking about that for decades. Prepare. First micro tendency. We are before a global disorder. In that global disorder, there is something happening at the speed of light. It's the multilateralism. It's in crisis. Big problems are not being solved through multilateralism. It seems, on the other side, that we have the mini lateralism in being enforced. One meeting is more important between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping to discuss about rare earth minerals than a discussion inside United Nations about this issue. It's more important a meeting of G20 right now to define regulation, financial regulation aspects and markets than the one that could be discussed in the International Monetary Fund or those that could be taken in the World Bank. And we are seeing how blocks are becoming to reaccommodate the OMC take decisions in terms of tariffs that they don't need to be discussed in a multilateral organization that deals with these areas. Sanctions from these entities have become relative. If you have doubts, 3 years ago in the UN General Assembly, the first Prime Minister of France or the UK were not present, neither Vladimir Putin, neither Xi Jinping, just Joe Biden. This shows that in those instances of power of the P5 permanent members of Security Council are not that important now. In a mini lateralism, we're seeing a surge of bilateral agreements. US takes a decision commercially, sits down with Vietnam and they close an agreement in hours and days with Mexico and Canada. With one solved the problems, the other one is still uncertain. So the question is why, for the insurance company, this unilateralism is transcendental because you have to forecast risks and you have to plan and provide certainty to your clients about things that did not depend of international consensus. More difficult than ever to deal with this terrain, but that is here to stay. And we all have to understand that primes, that the products will have to be adjusted faster than before. That's the first macro tendency. And the second element, many have tried to recreate the situation between China and the USA as a new Cold War. No, they're wrong. They're wrong because simply in the Cold War and the relation of the USA with the Soviet Union, they were never at interdependence of them. Soviet Union was not a great exporter to the United States. Neither the United States were neither an exporter or producer in the countries of the Soviet Union. We have a great tension today. There is ferocious competition of who will be in charge as a leader of AI. There are economic sanctions, there are agreements, but both of them are needed to coexist. World economy need both engines to grow, to to improve the life of middle class, to deal with poverty, to consolidate markets. This is not a new Cold War. It could be a hot piece full of tensions, constant tensions. And this is so complex as if you analyze of who have been the most important economic commercial partners in the USA individually in the last 15 to 20 years. Always China have been present. China is an important commercial partner for the USA and vice versa. Any decision have consequences in the value chains in both countries. It have consequences in the labor market. It have consequences in the costs the final consumer have to pay, and the rest of the world that they are part of the value chains of those two countries. If you have any doubts about it, I'll leave you with this reflection, more Latin American. In the year 2000, if we were to see who were the main partners of Latin America, commercially speaking, 95% of the countries of all of this region had as the main commercial partner the United States. If we see this same picture today, more than 90% of Latin American countries have China as their main commercial partner. And in the Caribbean, it could be between one and two, most of the countries, meaning that any confrontation between China and the United States in turn commercially or regulatory makes us in the South children of marriage that is separated. It becomes very complex, our situation, especially when we start to see a battle of loyalties. When the discussion is, who do you prefer? And in this deal, we know how countries, what kind of treatment they receive. Belt and Road Initiative that had been signed, we are seeing how Latin American countries, in its diplomatic freedom, they want to have a more constructive relation with Taiwan, they will get the warning. This geopolitical tension will happen many unexpected things. An increase, sudden increase of tariffs, a regulatory restriction in telecommunications markets, or sanctions that could be applied by child labor or environmental practices, or sanctions related to efficiency in the production or gas, greenhouse gases, overcosts, and sinisters. The industry have to forecast how difficult will be this scenario. Many people ask me, but you believe there will be a war between China and the United States? Because that's people sell this prophecy. I prefer not to believe that. It doesn't mean that I reject it, discard it, because you need to have a margin of possibility where we have unpredictable tensions. But I have a note about it. It would be imminent that China will invade Taiwan to trigger a conflict. Why Nvidia? It's the company of highest value in the world. Why a company that depends of all of these micro transistors, that depends of the value chain of Taiwan? The market is not punishing that risk. Interesting. That means there is a sector of the market that think no, because that tension can affect goods and services of China, and that they export, and that can affect, structurally speaking, a whole system, global system of trade between countries. That's the second macro tendency. The third one is something that I think is interesting to place it on the table. It's more political, if you will. Many times in the insurance company, we talk about, in the security sector, we talk about risk, but it has a lot of variables. The most dangerous one is we're seeing an increase, as never before, of uh, caudillos, caudillismo, meaning a lot of power concentrated in one person, in the chiefs of state, with a great capacity to take decisions with discretionality and many times above institutional order. We have cases of caudillismo that have brought a lot of stability. We have stability in El Salvador, for example. We have a substantial reduction of violence, and people feel at ease. But the power and the decision making process is concentrated in one person, meaning they have the control of the judicial branch of Congress. This provide regulatory uncertainty, taxing, and trade, and even it could be feelings of stability, is still a risk to ponder. We see caudillismo in Europe, caudillismo of Viktor Orban. We see caudillismo, of course, in South America. We saw it with Correa, with Evo Morales. We have seen it with Petro, with Luna. So powerful figures, and some of them with more institutional limitations and counterweights, like the case of Brazil. But this surge of caudillismo that is starting to penetrate more developed countries makes us that one person, one leader, the one who started changing the variables that before depending of a relation between Congress and many other instances of power. This makes a more difficult situation in order to predict risks, especially when caudillismo that pretends to consolidate power and to stay in power is taking decisions simply concentrated in the convenience, electoral convenience, that it is immediate. Before, when it was more institutional, governments and presidents were more tended more to make correct decisions, even if they were not popular, because quoting Winston Churchill, he said that the politician is spending of the next election and the statesman in the next generation. That variable is changing, and if we are to deny that, it's high risk. What are the proposals of governments? What are the big ideological apprehensions, which is the closest circle, who are part of the circles of influence of the decision makers? Many people ask me, what do you expect of the new presidency of Trump? I don't become passionate if I like it or not. I worked with him when I was president in Colombia. We we had a successful agenda together, but trade was potential. The only former president of the United States he quote was William McKinley, president that came from the Ohio State. He was the promoter of the most aggressive tariff regime in the first part of the previous century. He was assassinated, and that helped the rise to power of Theodore Roosevelt. But he was the most expansionist president of the United States. I don't, I'm not saying that Trump will behave the same, but there is an influence, and we have to understand who are behind these messages and why. Because what happened this week, for example, the previous week in New York, with the elections of Madame, where he had more than 70% of youngsters who are between 70 and 19 and 70. There is a sector of the young population in the United States, they don't feel capitalism is solving their problems. And there is an electorate who agree in more protectionist measures, who are just a discourse, and they feel this deals with their expectations. Neo-caudillistas, they don't care to be loyal to an ideology, and they don't care about the coherence with the past. They will take more and more volatile decisions, have to do more with the convenience of the following elections. Insurance sector will have to dedicate time to the analysis of political risk, and the decisions are more with more attention than the ones in the previous years. Out of this tendency, it could be very costly. Among other things, in the insurance sector in Latin America, many caudillistas, if they like the sector because they have money, it's very nice looking like you are in this morning, start taking decisions to pressure.
A sector that should be seen by the government as a big distributor of tools to protect the population, giving the biggest risk in the world. So that's the third issue. The fourth one is one that it's really close to my heart because I spend most of my time on sustainability, protecting the Amazonia, climate change, etc. And I've seen that in the past 7 months, there's some variation in the discourse by some sectors, by some industries, especially business leaders that used to be very outspoken and that were, how should I say it, controversial to showing us the most catastrophic results of climate change, which I agreed with, I, being honest. But now they have been changing their discourse. One of them is Bill Gates. Bill Gates, very recently, less than 4 or 5 years ago, in a very important book, he said that we got to have the same proportion between mitigation, which is doing everything we can to reduce the temperature and keep it stable in 1.5 degrees Celsius, and an important work of mitigation given the source of climate change. In the past 6 months, we've seen how Bill Gates is changed his discourse, and just last week he said, now we got to focus on, especially on adaptation. Mitigation is important, but since mitigation is where the big debate is going on what are we going to do to stabilize the temperature, now let's move to mitigation, which are decisions that are more commercial, urban planning, energy management, etc., etc. But this has repercussions because even if we change the discourse, and you know this better than anybody, never before have we seen so many hurricanes category 5 as the ones we've seen in the past 5 years. And that is something that is not going to change. And if the emphasis now we move it towards mitigation and we start to be irresponsible about these temperature increases and the implications they may have with regards to the marine currents, the ocean currents, and we're going to see a lot more incidents of coastal erosion. We're going to see a lot more environmental laws to protect the mangrove, and we're going to see how the insurance and the premiums that have to be paid for insuring those areas that are highly exposed to this risk are going to be skyrocketing. And if the markets are very small, the damage is going to be even worse because you've seen this before, right? That if we don't have a country with a big market where you're able to distribute the risk throughout all the premiums that are paid, then simply it's going to have to be you out of that market, get out of the market where the insurance cost, given the frequency of the events, it's unpayable, or it means the industry will leave. Something very similar to what happened in California with insurance with regards to wildfires, where several companies left the market, and we saw how many houses of very powerful people were lost with no insurance whatsoever. So now these changes and situations like this are going to have implications. And on the other side, we're going to see how this industry, which used to be one of the world leaders in terms of investment in ISG, the ISG speech is now changing. And it would seem that it's no longer applauded. Many of the big economies are not looking into it. And when it's not applauded, and the CEO is now going to have a conversation with the government, and they used to be proud of look at what we're doing, and DSG is no longer doing it, then we're going to see also a drop, a big drop, a drastic drop on the liquidity of the market for investment associated with ESG. And this has important implications for the industry. It has important implications on the events, disaster events. It has implication on politics. It has implementations on regulatory conditions. Why? Because I have always been convinced of the value of this industry, not because I'm here. And some of you here that know me from way back know, right? I see Dr. Colmenares, whom I know since the university, and he's older than me, just to be clear. But I have always believed in this industry, and this industry requires that it has to be overlooked, it has to be seen by the governments not as an aggravated sector, but as a sector that is trying to, should create a massive adoption, increase adoption, right? And the benefits that we're seeing in Latin America in the mountain corridors, the higher mountain corridors, are bringing ecosystem consequences, and it's gonna thin out the availability of water resources. The increase in the temperatures are going to make the incidence and prevalence of transmittable diseases grows in a huge way in the region, and that also means ensuring the health sector, and of course it has implications on the underwriting. And if we look into also issues that have to do with quality of life, a lot more, even more. So how can the insurance sector, solve this trend, this situation, this fourth trend? So it's going to have to speak up very clearly and say, okay, we will add ourselves to the big context of the mitigation, because that's where you have to get more products implemented. But if the industry is no longer calling for it, for adaptation to be consistent with the mitigation, that's where we're going to have a completely a gap. And I believe that's the best opportunity for the big public-private partnerships between the insurance sector and the governments, especially facing these type of risks. The fifth macro trend is not less challenging, and I have a reflection for you here about it. There is right now immigration challenge, but at the same time, there is a demographic risk. Let me give you some numbers. While we have this beautiful gathering here in Costa Rica, full of pura vida, around the world there are over 60 million migrants this year due to weather crisis, climate crisis. These are regional, domestic migrants. They are regional migrants and cross borders migrants, and this has consequences in xenophobes, indifference, stress on the labor market, and be aware. Many companies and many businesses are going to end up hiring much of those migrants without having all the necessary labor protocols, assuming huge reputation risk, huge professional risks, which, God willing, that it doesn't happen, it's going to affect a lot of the perspective the market has in these industries. Now, these trends are showing us today that the age average of the economically active population of the developed countries have to be understood in terms of the projections for the next few decades. China, for example. China is paying the consequences right now of their failed policy of one child. And China is going to have a reduction of close to 50% of its population with numbers of today in the next 3 decades. And so China, what is it going to do? Either it becomes better productive, or automizes and robotizes, or it has a more inclusive migrant policy, or it's going to have, by definition, a drop on the GDP, and there's going to be huge controversy and demands, such as the housing sector, that it's already clear in some Chinese cities, as well as the consumption, and it's going to experience it in the commerce, because the population is getting older, and not the entire population that is getting old is insured for that age. And that means implications and costs on the health system. In the United States, with the exception of the Hispanic minorities, all the other populational groups are seeing a drop on their birth rate. The only one that is still growing, and is growing very well, is the Hispanic population. But the United States has the same stress. And this, because of decisions in immigration policies, we now see some sectors that are being affected in the availability of labor, and the hotel sector in many cities, and therefore the costs go up. And that's where the insurance have to come in to mitigate this risk, which is going to bring market risk, interest rate, etc., etc. So look into that. Now, think about it from India's side. India has a huge revolution going on right now, and it's moving along, but we're going to see an disruption from India very big next decade, starting very soon. India has population under 18 years old. It's bigger than the entire population of North America. So India is going to start playing a huge role on those supply chains, on those value chains, on the market, on the labor market. It's going to take on the production that we used to be part of the Asian countries, but it's not going to be able to provide solutions to the population that is going to be requiring labor conditions. And that geopolitical factor is going to be huge. because they're gonna look for a lot more immigration paths. And of course, in India, there's people that are very talented, and one of the populations or minorities that is growing the most in the United States compared to others in the qualified labor market are the American Indian, the 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 Indian from India, and so the demographic variations are going to be substantial. But now let's apply this to the Latin American environment. In my country, Colombia, today 73% of the population is under 45 years old. That is great right now. It's a huge demographic advantage right now, but it is as long as the labor market is stable. Because if not, what's going to happen in the next 3 decades? People over 65 are going to be tripled, and therefore the pressure on the fiscal side on the health sector and the pressure on the general health insurance is going to be huge, and we're not going to have the fiscal resources thinking about that possible scenario today. And we already talked about the silver economy, right? That has also an important role. The fact of how this population is growing older with the impact of cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, it's going to add more additional pressure on the insurance market. So keep that in mind as another macro tendency. The sixth one, and this is my favorite one because I call it AI or RAI, and that is artificial intelligence is here to stay and it's there. And that artificial intelligence could be an angel or could be a devil. And what are the implications of it? I'm an optimist with regards to artificial intelligence, but beware, because yeah, we understand what are the implications, and we know what is the consequences for our region. We know what it says for the more vulnerable populations, and we're gonna find some huge surprises. Among others, I'm gonna say be prepared because in all the trends I'm looking at it in matters of labor market, I believe in the next 5 years you're gonna see a huge growth, uncontrolled growth, almost exponential growth on unemployment insurance. We're gonna lose a lot of a lot of work positions, and that is a simple reading that is undeniable, right, for the insurance sector. You're already seeing this today. You may have your actuaries, right, where artificial intelligence is replacing probably half or maybe even more of the workers. And today you see this in the marketing positions, for example. In fact, on legal analysis as well. In fact, on customer service, on services for customers with regarding their premiums, and also in a way that is almost intuitive for a person, because you can provide the specifications to an LLM that is connected to an insurance company so that we can have communication with the customer better than the communication that any agent will give. That reality is already there. So some of the positions are going to get lost, and now there's new positions going to be born. Of course, this is not the end of the world, but that difference from the lost jobs to the new jobs is going to need three main items. One is going to require a labor market that is adapted to the new reality, and the politicians are not really letting this happen. Why? Because since the population is also getting old, and whoever is doubting about it, look into Europe. There are countries in Europe like France that over 30% of the population is already over 65 years old. And the ones that are expecting to retire, they don't want different rules to retire because they are already going to be on the other side of the population. And when over 35% of the population has the political way of influencing the election, the politicians are going to try to regulate all the policies to move the voters, with a huge intergenerational conflict in fiscal policies. And this have to do with artificial intelligence as well, because to adapt ourselves, we need a more flexible labor market. This means that the unemployment insurance also have to be different. They have to be a lot more specific. And you have to understand this activity of people that may have three different jobs, They might work for just a few hours in each one, and so their participation in the corporate world between the person that acquires the insurance and the one that is delivering the insurance, it's changing. Changing already, in fact. Another thing, the cybercrime. Cybercrime is going to get bigger, and we're going to need a lot more insurance for cybercrimes. And no matter how much we are moving forward in electronic market, which region is more behind in electronic commerce? You may say Africa, yes, but Latin America is right next to it. Why? Because there are many elements of of distrust. And so we have to invest a lot more in cybersecurity by the stakeholders, by the companies, by the service providers. But at the same time, we have to develop a network of products that is capable of accompanying that penetration. Otherwise, we're not going to have one penetration of one or the other in the market. And on the other side as well, we have the challenge if we are creating the staff or the human capital to respond to this revolution in a region where, for example, we are highly controlled by union labels such as the labor unions such as the teachers, where we're not going to be able to change the education system to graduate the people that needs to be graduated for this new change. So we need to make changes, and we need to make these changes radically. The seventh trend, and this is also one of my favorites, we've all heard about the transition, energy transition. Energy transition, yes, that's one of my favorite topics. When I was a president, I received a country with a penetration, let's call it penetration, yes, so non-conventional renewable energies that was only 0.5% of our matrix. We had bids, double-side bids with buyers and vendors, and a lot of institutional companies promoted it, and we were able to multiply it over 100 times over, and almost 15% of the matrix is now renewable with non-conventional energies. And the world saw that debate, that discussion. But what has happened in the past 4 years? Number one, Ukraine happened. And Ukraine changed the way we see energy security, because many European countries says, look, we're gonna leave carbon behind, right? It's very bad. It's coal. We're gonna leave coal behind. It's very bad. It's very questionable, and let's start importing gas from Russia. That's going to give us security, and we're going to generate interdependency, and there's more interdependency, the more peace. If there's peace, we're not going to attack each other because we need each other. So you buy it, we need to buy it, we need to sell it. So what happens in the first 6 months of that war? Russia said, oh, you're going to give me sanctions, or you're going to start doing things. Let me shut off the gas line. And so it is, the word in English is weaponized. So that gas supply was used as a weapon to control the market. And many insurance companies didn't even have that in their radar. No, there's a contract, nobody's going to violate the contract. It's about the stability and the supply. But the rules changed completely. And then I had to experience that. I remember a call from all our my shaft that said, I was waiting to talk about renewable energy, and he said, and Mr. President, what are we going to do to get coal back in the country? They made a decision where, although the renewables were moving forward, they were now requesting coal once again, something that was in our agenda, not in my agenda or my energy ministry. And so what does it mean? It means that we are changing the discussion from energy transition for energy consolidation. That is the seventh micro politics trend. What do I mean by energy consolidation? That the expensive energy is the one that we don't have, and we have to find ways to consolidate all the available sources, because they're going to prioritize the energy safety and energy security, and be aware that that energy security is going to be based on the whatever combination is necessary to maintain the supply of energy. So far, everything sounds logical, right? But then we have other new factors come into play. That's what I said, right? In this new world, the complexity and the ambiguity. What were you doing November 30th, 2022? Do you remember? Probably many of you were like me with the anxiety of knowing in Argentina is going to beat Polonia in the World Cup in Qatar, and if Messi is going to be able to be a world champion with Argentina. That same day, November 30th, 2022, the market opens to the public market. ChatGPT becomes publicly available. And that it's a day to keep in mind in our recent history. November 30th, 2022. Today, OpenAI is demanding more energy as a company than over 100 countries in their entirety. It is completely changing the demand of energy. Last year, and this is it's recently published by the International Energy Council in their report of 2024, they said the following alert. In 2024, the energy demand came, it was bigger than the biggest year in the previous decade. The demand for energy grew again. Why? Because there was an increase of the demand for electricity itself, electrification itself. And what were the phenomena behind it? Well, yes, there was a city growth, of course, but look, we are going back into global warming, so we need refrigeration, right? The world, I know, builds cities, and these cities require more air conditioning than ever. But then the next big disruptive factor has been artificial intelligence. China by itself, it was close to 50% of that greater increase of energy demand in electricity demand in 2024, and China now doubles the installed capacity of solar energy and wind energy in the United States. And so, this have to do with geopolitics? Yes, of course, because China, for example, is 58% of the world demand on coal. China is reducing its emissions. It's diversifying its matrix, but at the same time, in the consolidation, they still want to use coal. India needs coal. And to be able to keep this entire revolution of the super AI that is coming, we are now talking about micro nuclear reactors in countries like the United States and other countries in Europe as well, because Europe, with the lack of resources they have in their energy on their energy market, they either go nuclear or they're going to be out of the artificial intelligence race, and that is geopolitical as well. So if the nuclear energy, biomass, wind energy, solar energy, and yesterday gas, and last year gas as well was the second source of growth after solar and wind, or even after the solar itself, it represented 26% of the energy demand in 2024. So, where are the natural resources going? Who's going to exploit them? Who's going to commercialize them, and what are going to be those market variables that could come out for unpredictable things that you know very well, such as something in the Stretch of Hormuz, something that may happen in the Suez Canal, etc., etc. But also, if we are talking about energy transition, a greater in-depth and that greater penetration of solar and energy have to do with rare materials, with rare minerals. Who concentrates that and who sells them? And in this region, only a country like, only the country of Bolivia has like 30% of the reserves of lithium in this region. So the disputes for those additional sources of energy, it's what we have to look into and create our forecast for the entire sector in the future. And especially if we are going back to talking about nuclear, we have to go in almost preemptive, as the English word says, which is preliminary and almost, in preparation for, to assess what is going to be the best way to average out all these risks. And technology is going to help us, but, keep that in mind. And my eighth trend, we are in a world where we once again go back to protectionism and isolation. We went back from the mantra of the big international trade to let's get involved in international trade. Let's be part of international trade. It will make us, stronger to growth. It would allow us to develop new industries. And you know what happens, at least in Latin America, what is happening? You know how much is Latin America's export in worldwide trade for services, for example? Only 6%. And when we look into Latin America, among ourselves, we have the same language, we share the same religion, we have the same, cultural traditions, identities. It turns out that the intra-regional commerce between Latin America and the Caribbean is less. It lost 15%, and last year it was only 13.2%. We are not interconnected. What does this make us? Makes us more vulnerable because we're gonna depend either from the United States or from China, and any decision, any protectionist decision in this matter will make us more vulnerable industry by industry. And the only way to get out of that vulnerability is to come with an integration with the region. But we are also have the political conditions looking into things that we didn't see in the past, such as what? My country, Colombia, and my the person that and the new administration does different things from me. Just to say something else, this morning he put on social media, new taxes on cars, new tariffs on cars, on motorcycles, and I said, well, that has to do with climate change, I guess. But no, it's an ultra protectionist measure that we have not seen before, and that is impacting the more vulnerable families that are the ones that use motorcycles to move around within the national territory, and that it isolates us from different value chains as well. And we are seeing at least 6 or 7 countries in Latin America that in the last year have started to impose tariffs selectively on trade conditions that were not part of the discussion before. So we're going to see a lot more protectionism? Yes. We're going to see an use of economic attack on our trade-based sectors? Yes, of course. And the question here is, who is going to defend the world of these situations? The WTO? The WTO doesn't have any tools, capacity, or authority to do this, and nobody's going to really allow the WTO to do a proper management of the situations, regrettably. The multilateral organizations may make some suggestions, and only the countries that are already in the OECD, for example, that have some best practices working, they might have some mechanisms to deal with it. But if the protectionisms and isolationism and it goes with populism and totalitarianism, we're going to have a situation that is going to get more and more complex in the commercial side, in the trade side, and we're going to have to develop more bilateral agreements. And then the risk, industry by industry, are going to be huge. We had, in the case of Colombia, just a few weeks ago, exposed once again due to tweeting imprudence by the country, by the president, that for the United States to put sanctions on the flower market of the Colombia, where we already have a 10% tariff. An additional 10% tariff will last 200,000 positions in Colombia. That's the level of uncertainty we have to adapt to. And the ninth trend, I don't know if you can see it here on the screen, is one topic that I'm most concerned for because nobody talks about this, and that is the debt. I don't know how much time you spend talking about this in your bilateral meetings here, but the levels of GDP debt around the world, and we have the Vice Ministry of Expenses on the country from Costa Rica. Today, the GDP debt is over 90% according to the World Bank worldwide. So, in one way or another, we have markets that are heavy believers on the borrowers. But the question is, how long are the markets going to allow this, and what's going to happen to those that go into debt irresponsibly? An example: Colombia, for example, has GDP debt that is 60% or more, and it's going to have next year the biggest fiscal deficit of its history, close to 8%. But if you are portfolio investors, you could be buying Colombian bonds in Colombian pesos with profit of 12, 14% rates. And who's going to be willing to have a debt on that level, right? Who's going to invest on that level? Well, the person that believes that the story of a country like Colombia that has never have defaulted is going to do it, and that is going to give them an extra margin until suddenly something unforeseen happens. Colombia has tried to be responsible to make sure that this doesn't happen, but there are other countries in Latin America, Bolivia, for example, in a situation that is highly unsustainable. Argentina has seen in the past few weeks some runs of dollars that have never seen for 20 years, and that the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessig, had to go out and buy Argentinian pesos and give a message that they are willing to help Argentina, cost what it costs. This term is given by the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. So levels so high worldwide might make it that the default scenarios in different regions of the world may trigger in the next few years, and that's where the markets have become a lot more sophisticated, because the markets themselves have shown that they are no longer going into these systemic risks. But situations may be affecting it. And why do I think this is important for all of you? Because this could have an impact on the interest rate. This could have an impact on the exchange rate. This could also affect you as institutional investors. The one thing I like to finish by saying is the macro trend on the rare earth minerals. I already mentioned some already. The control of the rare earth minerals is going to be the next big discussion.
Environmentally, we'll see how the adaptation discourse would have to include the mining sector in order to have a transition. We'll have more mining. In order to have more mining, we have more consulting. Previously, authoritarian regimes would not do it. It would require to have a reduction of emissions, compensations of emissions. It will generate a big pressure over, especially auditing, hear me well, and climate accounting. This will have to affect the environmental assets. You are aware of this. You have instruments for that, but with the new climate accounting, many of your assets that were pondered in terms of the past will not be the same. People will lose money and can end up so valuable as the reduction of gap auditing practices widely adopted. I'll leave you with this food for thought. I want to close after these 10 macro tendencies by saying, what would I expect of the insurance sector? What's urgent? Number one, insurance sector in every political campaign, and this is coming. It's a good season coming. We will have elections in Chile. We just had them in Bolivia, in Honduras, in Costa Rica, Colombia, Brazil, and then Guatemala, and then Peru. It would be a super electoral cycle. Which of the candidates have a discourse for the insurance sector? Very, very few. And this sector have an obligation, have to multiply multiply itself to become a general access in society, and this implies to have an active participation of the government in the massification of insurance. We are still one of the regions of the world with the lowest primes, life primes, with lower levels of insurance of public infrastructure. We are in the list of on the 50 more exposed countries to the effects of climate change. We have paradoxes. Many countries, when people buy a home, they have insurance just in case they die when until they pay. But once they die, nobody keep paying the insurance. Insurance that are related with professional risks will change. Unemployment will change. But everything at the same time, where we see more governments intervening pension markets, affecting the participation of the sector as an institutional investor. The message for me, we have to show the political value, social and economic value that the massification of insurance have in a society. And I don't come here just what you want to hear. As a president of a country, we multiply 6 times more the number of suppliers of, of agricultural insurers. It's still small, but we work actively. We develop a policy to expand parametric insurance before big climate shocks and natural disasters. When I was working in the Inter-American Development Bank, I saw the cat bonds that began in Mexico and the Caribbean. In order to have parametric elements required in the financial instruments of the countries, it required a macro insurances for all of these small companies that will become formalized in our societies, and the identity of the sector requires also to show governments that the worst thing they can do is the tendency of keep taxing the insurance sector. The more they tax the sector, i- they miss the possibility of democratizing society. This is my last image. This is a work. Carlos Cruz Diaz, one of the biggest Latin American artists, Venezuelan Cinetics movement. He had an exposition in Paris because Fides have seen a lot, analyze our region. You have been able that these debates become very productive, but today more than ever, when we see these tendencies of global disorder, minilateralism, the surge of caudillos, when we see the risks of indebtedness, when we see the changes between transition and energetic consolidation, when we see the changes in the narratives of climate change, when we see the demographic pressures, when we see the transition towards AI, when we see the regulatory conflicts, the high taxes of indebtedness, people will say all of this sounds problematic. I approach it in a different way. It's, I look at it as an opportunity. The pandemic was good for Colombia because in the middle of so much crisis and pain, we is it's the biggest financial inclusion in history. In digital inclusion, it helped us to increase public investment as a reactivator. And in the middle of such a sinister, to take advantage of the 6 months where people sometimes have to change their skills to multiply the number of programmers in our country that now makes of Colombia a big hub of technology. These macro tendencies are not to look at him as with the eye of catastrophe. It's a reason to become adapted. We have the possibility in Latin America to make of this discourse of financial inclusion, inclusion education, starting from insurance, a mean to face all of this uncertainty. I close with the quote I began with. If we are not prepared, we will get into a situation of crisis. If we are prepared, we should use the penetration of insurance, the public partnerships, public private analysis, to multiply tools for agricultural producers, protection before risk, mitigation and adaptation of climate change, protection of industries that will be needed for of this transition as one of the most important pillars of development. So, I hope in the rest of this event can develop this reflection that with these tendencies this sector have means to play and to become an engine for development. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, President Iván Duque Márquez. The board of the Association of Private Insurers of Costa Rica will hand you a recognition. Here they are. Thank you.